Hey everyone, and welcome back to Timeless. If you don't know me, I'm one of the experts on energy in the format. I finished rank number 9 overall in Constructed playing energy, and I have an 80% win rate on this version of the deck with over 100 games played. And I'm super excited that recently they announced both a metagame challenge and that the format for the upcoming qualifier is going to be Timeless. So I know a lot of new players are going to be looking to play Timeless to pick up this deck, and also since energy got banned in Historic, I know there's going to be a lot of energy players migrating over. So I've been working on this deck and refining it for the past month or two since Modern Horizons 3 came out. This is one of my favorite decks ever of all time, and I have a lot of knowledge to share on sideboarding and how to approach matchups. So the sideboard guide in terms of what cards go in, what cards come out, is completely written up. It's in the description. If you want to just take it and use it and stop watching the video now, it's totally fine. I just ask that before you click off the video, you like, subscribe, comment, do the little YouTube interaction thing to help out my channel just a little bit. If you want to stick around and watch the video, I am going to go over my thoughts on every single sideboard card, my thoughts on all the matchups, the thoughts on why we're sideboarding in specific ways, and like my wish list on what sideboard cards we could have if we had more than 15 sideboard slots, or if I wanted to go ahead and make a change. So I think the best way to go about this is just go in order through the sideboard guide and talk about what cards go in, what cards come out, why, and what our role is in the matchup. So up first is going to be combo decks, and we're going to start with the big bad of the format, show and tell. So in game one against combo decks, we are just trying to goldfish them, and if you aren't familiar with the term goldfish, it means imagine you're playing against your pet goldfish. They're not going to interact with you, you're just slamming cards on the table and go as fast as possible. So our deck does have a lot of really fast goldfish lines. For example, playing in a Johnny and flipping it to Goblin Bombardment, or having multiple copies of Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride. So game one, when you realize that you are up against these unfair decks, you do want to try and race them. Unfortunately, Show and Tell can win on turn 3 pretty often. They can even win on turn 2, some versions of the deck, which is nuts. So obviously you're not going to outrace that, but on average, you do have a chance to outrace them game one. Of course, they're faster than you on average, which is why the deck is unfavored and why we're going to have so many sideboard cards for them. So against Show and Tell, we're generally taking out removal spells. If I look at my sideboard guide on my other monitor, I say we take out the Galvanic Discharge and one of the Swords to Plowshares. We keep in one of the copies because oftentimes they are going to cheat something like Atraxa into play. And we only have so many sideboard cards to bring in. And we also bring out the Chthonian Nightmares, because Chthonian Nightmare is a grindy card, is for when you are in fair matchups, when the matchups are going to go long. And even in games 2 and 3, we are goldfishing while slamming hate pieces, so we don't want Nightmare. I know Nightmare is a way to flip a Johnny, it is a way to build a board presence, but it is often too slow for these matchups. And what you end up bringing in are Thoughtseizes and extra Juggernaut Peddlers to disrupt their hands. So now we're going to have 6 discard effects, and we also bring in the Vexing Baubles. Vexing Bauble forces them to have an answer to it, such as Veil of Summer to make their stuff uncounterable, or Artifact Enchantment removal. Keep in mind, we're playing Vexing Bauble specifically over Deafening Silence. I used to have Deafening Silence in this spot for 2 reasons. One, because Force of Vigor is a very common Artifact Enchantment destruction card that they're going to play in their sideboards. And they cannot use that card against Vexing Bauble. They have to pay 4 mana. 4 mana is a lot. They have to spend their whole turn 4 doing it. So it's a big ask. So that's why we were playing Vexing Bauble over Deafening Silence or another option. And a second reason we're going to play the Bauble is because it also has legs against scam decks, people who are cheating their elementals into play. So if you're against like a Beans deck where they're cheating a bunch of things into play for free and they're not paying for their spells, you can go ahead and bring this thing in that matchup too. So that's why the Deafening Silence in the sideboard has changed to Bauble recently. Both cards are quite good, and if you want to make an argument for Deafening Silence, I would certainly listen to you. And if you wanted to put 3 of the Deafening Silences in your sideboard instead of 3 Baubles, I think that's completely valid. But I've personally been running Bauble after I switched to it, and I do really like it. So the philosophy with sideboarding here is we're taking out these slower grindy aspects because we are just trying to win the game as quickly as possible, and we're using one of our sideboard cards, hopefully we draw 1 or 2 of them, to disrupt our opponent and just slow them down. Because it's pretty easy to show and tell, put together like the A plus B on turn 3, especially when they get to play like Brainstorm, Assemble the Team, blah, 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 all those silly cards. But if we Thoughtseize them and take one of their part of A plus B, then they have to dig for another card, they have to find another tutor, it makes them stumble, and hopefully that stumbling makes them combo on turn 5 on average. If they're comboing turn 5 on the draw, then we're going to kill them. We're going to kill them on turn 4 or 5 on the play, because show and tell doesn't really play removal spells. So that's the whole idea here. The same with the Bauble. With Bauble, what happens is your opponent doesn't just have to find A plus B, just the show and tell plus the omniscience. What they need to do is they also need to find Artifact Enchantment Hate, and they need to find one that's not free, like Force of Vigor. Of course, they have Abrupt Decay in their deck, but now you're asking them to find A plus B plus C, and if you did a Thoughtseize as well, and you took away B, then they have to find B twice, and that's the whole philosophy here. You're not trying to go very long against show and tell. That's why you take cards like this out. You're just trying to win quick. We're going to hopefully have an opening hand that has one of these sideboard cards and a bunch of other proactive threats so that we can flood the board, throw down a sideboard card right before they combo off, and hopefully that slows them down just enough for us to get the goldfish kill in on like turn 4 or turn 5 before they get to do their show and tell thing. And it is a tough matchup. Even with sideboard cards, it can be quite tough. And it can be quite tempting to keep opening hands that goldfish without your sideboard cards, and it is very skill intensive to mulligan correctly with this deck. There's no single tip that I could give you to mulligan correctly against show and tell specifically. Just my main tip would be to try to envision your first few turns and say, all right, in this matchup, I'm goldfishing with disruption. Can I kill my opponent on turn 4 and disrupt their plan? Or kill them on turn 5 and disrupt their plan? Or if they don't have disruption, can I kill them on turn 4 when we're on the play? And hopefully that's fast enough. Would my hand that I have right now be better than the average 6 at doing that? Just ask yourself those questions when you mulligan. It is very difficult, and it's going to take you a while to get the hang of it. I have a separate video on how to mulligan, a little tutorial on that, if you want to look that up after this one. All right, up next we have Shift and Tell, which is show and tell's brother. Against Shift and Tell, we are bringing out the same removal spells. We're going to bring out the Galvanic Discharge. We're going to bring out the Static Prisons, as well as the Swords and the Chthonian Nightmares. We're really going to leave in one of the Static Prisons. And we're going to make rooms for a lot of cards on the sideboard. So we bring in some of the same cards that we brought in for show and tell. We bring in Juggernaut Peddler, and we also go ahead and, I believe, bring in the Baubles. Yes, we do. But on top of that, we're also bringing in Graveyard Hate. So we're going to bring in Unlicensed Hers, Surgical Extraction, and then also Pithing Needle to name Shifting Woodlands. So Shift and Tell is the version of show and tell where they copy up Omniscience with Shifting Woodlands. They also often play the card show and tell as well. So you do need to be wary of that. So that's why we have Vexing Bauble in the deck still, of course. We have Hand Hate. But one notable thing is that we're not bringing in Thoughtseize. And the rationale here is that Shift and Tell is a deck that's actually okay with being discarded because they want to hit Delirium and they want to get their Omniscience into their graveyard, right? If you Thoughtseize your opponent and you see an Omniscience, you obviously don't want to take it. So that's why we play Juggernaut Peddler specifically. And I want to talk about this card here because this card is so awesome as a 4-of. Please craft it. It took me a while to convince myself to craft it, and I really haven't regretted spending the 4 rare wild cards. This is a funny little guy that exiles a card when it enters the battlefield. Imagine if Thoughtseize exiled. The card goes away forever. It's just on forever. It's awesome. Yeah, sure, it gives your opponent a 4-drop, whatever, but this card is useless to most decks. The only decks where the card is marginally useful is a Brainstorm deck, if they can brainstorm it away, but still, I will take any opportunity to exile Omniscience from my opponent's hand instead of allowing it to hit the graveyard. So I love Juggernaut Peddler. He holds the deck together. I know we sideboard out the Nightmare in this matchup, but there are times where you have these two in play together, and you just loop the Peddler and you destroy your poor little opponent's hand. Oh, it's so satisfying whenever matchups like that happen. I love this guy. You could replay him with Lures to get additional value. He's also just a 2-mana 2/2 Vigilance. He contributes very well to the aggro plan just by being a 2-power attacker with a keyword on him. Now talking about the rest of the cards we bring in. Obviously we're bringing in Licensed Hearse against a graveyard deck that is going to try to hit Delirium, but we also have Surgical Extraction. Surgical Extraction is a card I'm planning on making a separate video on how to use it because it's like one of the most misused cards I see on Timeless Ladder. I see people main decking it, but I'm going to tell you how to use it in this matchup. You are going to wait for your opponent to try to activate Shifting Woodlands in order to use this card in response. When your opponent pays 4 mana to activate Shifting Woodlands to copy something in the graveyard, that trigger goes onto the stack. You can respond to that trigger by saying, I surgical the thing in your graveyard. There's very few ways for Shift and Tell to actually stop you. Some versions of the deck do play counter spells, But generally, if you're playing against a version without counter spells, you're going to want to wait for your opponent to activate the Shifting Woodlands and then, in response, Surgical Extraction. You do it that way so that your opponent wastes 4 mana and essentially wastes their turn. If you think your opponent's playing the version that has mana drain in it, then there are arguments to Surgical Extraction when you see Omniscience and they're tapped out. If you are playing against counterspell deck, I do like the idea of surgically extracting the win con just whenever they're tapped out. But in general, you are going to wait until they try to copy it or until they try to do something with it with surgical extraction. Because the thing is, surgical extraction, if you don't do it in response to a card like Reanimate, it's card disadvantage, right? You trade 0 mana and 1 card to remove something from a graveyard. If you remove your opponent's win condition, that's fantastic. But if you're removing a random card from their deck, not as good. And if they have multiple win conditions, for example, the Shift and Tell decks actually play both one with the Multiverse and Omniscience, so that it can't be surgical. So if you're trying to surgical the Omniscience and they also have a one with the Multiverse, then what you want to do is you want to make sure you either get a card advantage or a mana advantage when you use surgical extraction. So the example I gave of using it against Reanimate doesn't come up in this deck, but you essentially trade the cards one for one at that point, and surgical extraction becomes a 0 mana counterspell, so it's not card disadvantage. When you surgical the Omniscience in response to Woodland activating, yes, it's card disadvantage because you traded 1 card in your hand for 0 in their hands, but what you traded for was 4 mana, which is big. You're trading a card for 4 of your opponent's mana. I'll take that when I'm trying to kill them the following turn. I'll absolutely take that. So that's the idea with surgical in this matchup. Be patient. Use it at the last possible moment. You can respond to every trigger in their deck, unless they have defense grid up. They play defense grid. They're not going to bring in defense grid against you when you're on energy, though. So wait, be patient with this card. Did I go over the other ones yet? Needle for Woodland? I believe I did say that. Bobble just for free spells. If you throw a Bobble in play, it's going to be tough for them to do their thing. Juggernaut Peddler, my beloved, we went over him already. All right, what's the next combo deck up? Jet Storm. So that's the really cool new one that Greaseball cooked up. That is the Necropotence deck where you put Jet Medallion into play, and then Marionette Apprentice, Chthonian Nightmare triggers go burr. And then you get 20 Marionette Apprentice triggers and just like ping your opponent death. Super fun. So there's a bunch of ways to disrupt that. The cards that you're going to take out for that, I debated over it a little bit. Obviously, one of them is a Nightmare, as this usually comes out against combo decks, and I kind of mulled over what my last cut for this matchup is, and I think it's Discharge. I might change my mind. Oh no, I'm reading the wrong one. Yeah. It's also Ragavan, right? I was like, no, I have more than 6 cards to bring in. It's Discharge and Ragavan. Ragavan gets blocked. They play a bunch of like little 1/1s in their deck. They play like those 1/1s that make a treasure when they die. So we don't want our 2/1 little funny monkey getting blocked and for value. And we're going to take out Discharge too, because what you really need against their creatures is exile removal. They want their creatures to die because they just Chthonian Nightmare them back. So I think this card comes out. I'm not sure because like they are at the end of the day still technically a creature-based combo deck, so you probably do want removal, instant speed interaction, but I would prefer that to be in the form of Swords to Plowshares. So the cards that do come in here against Jetstorm are the Juggernaut Peddlers, my beloved, because you get to exile their Marionette Apprentice instead of sending it to the graveyard, which is awesome. 1 Hearse to put constant pressure on their graveyard. If you hold up Hearse activation, then they can't do their combo unless they can like do multiple, like they have multiple nightmares. They can do it multiple times, and they have like multiple nightmares and multiple things to bring it back, or just the ability to cast that same nightmare multiple times. What else comes in? 2 Surgicals. Same thing as the other matchup. Same advice. You're going to wait for your opponent to use Chthonian Nightmare to bring their creature back before you surgical. You are not going to randomly surgical Dark Ritual out of their deck. Do not do that. You're going to wait and use it to counterspell, quote unquote, their combo as it happens. You want them to go all in on their combo and then surgical them on the absolute last moment, because when your opponent's playing a Necropotence deck, oftentimes they draw down to 1 HP and they lose the ability to draw more cards. So if you surgical their little treasure dorks and they don't have a way to draw more treasure dorks, then they just lose. What else is coming in? 2 Pithing Needles. Yep. So if you play Pithing Needle on turn one, you're going to name Necropotence, and if your opponent already has Necropotence down, don't name Necropotence because they will just activate it in response. Instead, you name Chthonian Nightmare, which is their win condition. Unfortunately, if they resolved Necropotence already, they're probably going to be able to tutor for Artifact Enchantment, like Haywire Might to blow this up, but it's still worth doing because it's going to slow your opponent down just a little bit and tax their resources a bunch more. And we are also going to be bringing in Thoughtseizes as well, just because we want to Thoughtseize them as early as possible. Against this deck, I highly, highly, highly recommend Thoughtseizing turn one instead of playing your one drop on turn one. I know this deck, it loves to throw down the Guide of Souls or the Ragavan or the Ocelot Pride on turn one and get snowballing, but you need to Thoughtseize turn one because you need to take their Necropotence or their Dark Ritual that accelerates them into the Necropotence. Honestly, if I look at a hand and I see both Ritual and Necro, I'm still going to almost always take Necro unless it was like a really greedy one-lander. So try to use your hand hate early and as fast as possible. That covers it for that deck. So against any other Necropotence decks, these are Necropotence decks that do not rely on the graveyard in the same way, and they don't play the Treasure Dorks. Against these decks, we keep Ragavan in, because Ragavan is generally not going to be blocked. And we also take out the Nightmares again and the Discharges, because we're not going to have too many targets for the removal. The other Necropotence decks that I have in mind are like Sorin Combo and Mono Black Devotion, and what's Discharge really going to hit in those decks? You know, you can't really discharge a Saint Alenda. You can discharge Sorin after he does his ability. Oh boy. So against those decks, you're going to bring in the Juggernaut Peddlers, my beloved, of course. You're going to bring in the Thoughtseizes so that you have 6 discard spells, and we're going to bring in Pithing Needle. In that case, you're trying to name Necropotence with the Pithing Needle unless your opponent already had it in play. In which case you're going to name Sorin or whatever their combo win condition is. All right, Goblin Charbelcher. Oh, I forgot to scroll down. My bad, guys. Talking about it without it on the screen. So against Goblin Charbelcher, which is, I think it's a good combo deck, but I haven't seen anybody play it in a minute. I've encountered it like once in the past month. And against Charbelcher, it's actually the exact same sideboarding. You're going to bring in your Thoughtseizes and your Juggernaut Peddler, which sucks is that they're a Leyline of Sanctity deck. They like literally main deck it. So sometimes you eat rocks and or you kick rocks and your Thoughtseizes get blanked, but it's still definitely worth bringing it in because they're only like 37% to actually have a Leyline in play on 7, I believe. And you're also bringing Pithing Needle, which is absolutely going to be your best card in the matchup. Keep in mind, your Charbelcher opponents aren't stupid. They're going to have ways to blow up the Pithing Needle, but like I said, against Show and Tell, all that you're trying to do is slow them down. Charbelcher, all that they need to do is get 7 mana and put Charbelcher into play and activate it on the same turn. That's all that they actually need to do. But if you say, hey, you need 7 mana and a Charbelcher in play and activate it and blow up my thing, it gets harder for them to do that on turn 3. And oftentimes they can only assemble that on like turn 5, turn 6 sometimes. And that's when you just kill them with the silly little monkey. All right, up next for combo, we're now on to creature combo decks. Woohoo! Against Yawgmoth in particular. It's not one I've seen in a while, but I'm going to talk about it. The cards that come out against Yawgmoth, I wasn't sure about this. I haven't seen it in a while, so I haven't had a chance to test it. But I think against creature combo, I lean away from discard, and I actually don't want the Juggernaut Peddlers to stay in. And then I also take out Ragavan, depending if we're on the play or the draw. If we're on the play, we're going to take out Chthonian Nightmare and 1 Ragavan because we need 3 cards to come out. And when we're on the draw, we're going second. We're more in the control role. Ragavan is not really going to get to attack. So then we take out all of our Ragavans. That makes sense. Cards that come in, we bring in the Pithing Needle for Yawgmoth. That's big. We bring in Swords to Plowshares for extra creature removal. Bring in Prismatic Ending for extra creature removal. Sorcery speed, unfortunately, but this removes anything, including any sideboard cards that you might have for you. Any goofy artifact enchantments, Agatha, Soul Cauldron, whatever they're playing. And then we bring in Unlicensed Hers because it's a good way to mess with their Young Wolf shenanigans. I thought about whether or not Surgical is worth it for this matchup. I don't think Surgical on Young Wolf is going to win you the matchup, so I decided against it. I haven't like seen it in a month though, so trying to cover all my bases with the sideboard guide, but not all of these are super common. Up next, we have Sam Combo, which is very similar, but it's a bit more all in on the graveyard. So it's going to be the same sideboarding as Yogg, except we're always taking out Ragavans. It's not play draw dependent. So we're always taking out these 7 cards here. Again, I'm going to lean away from creature hate. We're going to bring in the same creature removal, the same hearse, the same Pithing Needle to name whatever their sack outlet is. But this time we're going to bring Surgical Extraction because Sam combo does combo using the graveyard always, whereas Gog sometimes uses the graveyard with Young Wolf loops, sometimes it doesn't. With Sam combo, they're always comboing with a Cauldron Familiar hitting the graveyard, so you could just Surgical that. It gets tough sometimes to Surgical the Cauldron Familiar because what the Sam deck can do is they can stack up food. So I would suggest actually Surgicaling the cat as soon as possible before they get multiple foods into play. And if they put their cat onto the graveyard without foods to bring it back, then that's probably a mistake on their part. All right, against Amalia combo. So this is a combo deck that is just very creature oriented. You can't Pithing Needle it or anything. So what I like to bring in against them is just the creature removal, the Prismatic Ending, and the Swords to Plowshares. And then what comes out depends on whether or not we're on the play draw again. So once again, it's going to be Ragavan when we're on the draw, because on the draw, Ragavan's less likely to connect. He's more likely to just be blocked. That stupid 1/3 Wild Growth Walker, which is personally the worst card I've ever tried to play in Timeless. It will block it. But then on the play, when we are bringing our Ragavans in, we're going to take out Bowmasters to make room for those removal spells, because there aren't too many targets for Bowmasters in the Amalia deck. The Amalia deck, it doesn't draw cards. So this card is really mid. If I had more sideboard cards, I would take out Bowmasters, even more copies of it, but unfortunately we only have the 2 sideboard cards for it, because their combo, it doesn't get hated out by this hate piece or this hate piece, or hit the graveyard. And I think that extra Thoughtseizes and Peddlers are worth it against a creature deck that will beat you down most of the time. Because what's cool about Amalia is that they often like beat you down instead of just comboing. It's more of a mid-range deck than a combo deck. I question whether or not it even belongs in this category. Up next, we have All-In Reanimator, and when I say that, I mean like somebody is trying to like Faithless Looting the Annihilator Eldrazi into their graveyard, then cast the card Reanimate on it. I don't mean like just somebody who's playing Scam deck with Reanimate in it. So against All-In Reanimator, we are going to want to bring out our removal spells, because they usually don't play small creatures. They usually just play the big stupid ones that they're trying to cheat into play. We definitely do want to keep our Exile removal, though. And the other things we're going to bring out are the Chthonian Nightmare, and we're going to bring out Bowmasters. Just because Bowmasters generally is not going to have targets against their deck. If they do have Faithless Looting in their deck, you might want to consider keeping this in over some of your other cards. You know, it depends on the texture of their deck. If you notice they have a bunch of like cheap, like the Treasure Dorks or something, or Vampire Neonate to block your Ragavan, then you might choose to play Bowmasters over Ragavan. You know, you can feel free to use your own judgment and not follow the sideboard guard too closely. What I like to bring in is Thoughtseizes Juggernaut Peddler, of course, to take Reanimate out of their hand. We bring in Surgical Extraction because I think Surgical Extraction is very strong when you use it in response to the card Reanimate. It becomes a 0-mana counterspell at that point. I'm very excited to use the card in that situation. And oftentimes you're getting more than one card's worth of value because your opponent probably spent like a Faithless Looting to put that card into their graveyard in the first place with the plan of reanimating it. So you get a huge tempo win if you can Surgical as they reanimate. We also bring in Pithing Needle, depending on whether or not you need it. If you don't need the Pithing Needle, like obviously make the judgment of what exactly your opponent is reanimating. Whether or not you need this. If you don't need the Pithing Needle, then you could feel free to like leave the Chthonian Nightmare in your deck. Just depends on what they're doing. And the only other thing that we're bringing in is, of course, Hearse for the Reanimator deck. All right. Up next is going to be Prime Time. So, pending, you know, I'm questioning, why do I have Pithing Needle in against Reanimator? I think I'm going to go take that out right now. All right, I removed Pithing Needle from Reanimator. I'm not sure why I was bringing it in there. I'm not sure what I was thinking of when I wrote up this list. I can't quite remember right now, so I'm going to assume it was a mistake on my part. And right now we're going to be bringing in 7 and 7. Okay, that's balanced. Primeval Titan. This is one that we don't see as often on ladder, but it is really strong. We're going to bring in all of our discard, and we're also going to bring in the Swords to Plowshares to answer their big creatures. And then out against them, no small creatures for priority removal, so we bring out our Galvanic Discharges, and then we also bring out one of our Nightmares. All right, Buried Alive Phoenix, that's going to be the last one. This is pretty similar to Reanimator. I think it's the exact same sideboarding that I chose against them. So it's the Peddlers, the Thoughtseizes, the Hearse, and the Surgical Extraction. In Buried Alive Phoenix, you are once again trying to Surgical either in response to the Phoenix trigger coming back, or in response to the card reanimate, wait until the last second, please, 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 when you use this card. You don't need to use it earlier than that. Make your opponent commit their resources to try and reanimate something before you blow them out with Surgical. And then out against this matchup, same exact stuff. There's not going to be much to discharge. Like, you could say, yeah, you could discharge a Phoenix, but I'd rather hit the Phoenix with the Exile removal. Just discharging it is whatever. It's an okay play in game one, but realistically, we're just going to try to prevent our opponent from getting the Phoenix into play in the first place. Bring out Chthonian Nightmare, because if we wait too long, our opponent is going to get those Phoenixes back eventually, I'm sure. And Bowmasters as well. I only take out the one Bowmasters because these decks are usually Faithless Looting decks, and Bowmasters is a very good way to punish that strategy. If they're not on looting for some reason, then maybe you want to take out more Bowmasters and keep Nightmare in, but I think every single Reanimator version does play looting. And by Reanimator, I meant Phoenix, Buried Alive. All right, up against Control, we are trying to clock them, and we're trying to keep in the appropriate cards to interact with them, which is generally just discard. So against most Control decks, we're going to end up taking out the Galvanic Discharges. We're going to also take out Chthonian Nightmare because this card can be too slow and too clunky against them sometimes. And also, depending on the variant of Control, we're going to take out some copies of Swords to Plowshares. Against Flage decks, we're probably going to leave in a copy of Swords. Against non-Flage decks, we probably take all of them out. Again, use your judgment for the specific Control decks that you're playing against. If you're playing against like a Control deck with a different win condition, you're obviously going to leave in certain cards based on that win condition. And then in general, what we're looking for against Control decks is to bring in our hand hate. So Thoughtseize and Juggernaut Peddlers. Trust me, Blue-White Control cannot do anything useful with the Juggernaut. We're also going to bring in Unlicensed Hearse if they are playing Flage. We're also going to bring in Pithing Needle. Is to name the One Ring, or Planeswalker like Big Teferi if they are playing it. And if I scroll down a little more, it's more or less the same idea for Blue-White Control. We just don't have Hearse in here because they don't play the Escape Elemental, and we take out all of the Swords to Plowshares because they don't have a big finisher like Flage. They're just trying to get you out with the Teferi. Right, and that's it for Control. Up next is Tempo decks, which is really just the one very popular blue-black Tempo deck. So against that deck, I'm changing my sideboarding plan based on play draw, which I don't often do, but Ragavan is a card that does accelerate a lot on the play. Like on the play, an unblocked Ragavan is absolutely fantastic, and you're really checking the blue-black deck and saying, do you have a removal spell for this right now, turn one? And they don't always have it. So when we are on the play, we actually don't sideboard that much. We only sideboard in a Hearse, and then we take out one of our Nightmares because we are the faster deck. We're going to be on the beatdown, so we take out our Grindy card, and then we attack their graveyard. I do like Unlicensed Hearse for fair mirror matches where both decks are using the graveyard a little bit. I used to have 2 copies. I went down to 1 at a certain point. If we had 2 copies, I would still bring in both of them and take out both of the Nightmares. I do think the card's pretty sweet. But when we're on the play, we're going to try not to overboard. And then when we are on the draw, what we're going to do is we're going to take out the 3 Ragavans because he's going to get blocked really easily on the draw. He's going to die to Orcish Bowmasters. It's going to be a tragic day for the little monkey boy. And then what we do is we bring in the Hearse again, but we also bring in the removal when we're on the draw because they are going to be playing the threats proactively. They're going to be slamming Psychic Frog on 2 if they feel like they can. And we are going to need to Swords to Plowshares that Psychic Frog on 2. Otherwise, we are going to get absolutely bullied. I'm not 100% on the sideboarding for this matchup because the blue-black deck's a tough deck to play against. The play patterns change game to game, which is why it's a super fun deck to play. Also, there's new variants of it popping up. The guys, I think, have been playing around with Esper versions of it, playing Swords to Plowshares. So maybe you can play Juggernaut Peddler and bring that in just to have a little bit more hand hate, maybe play some Thoughtseizes. At least this is my current thoughts. If you're wondering about the matchup, by the way, it's slightly favored for energy, but like realistically, the better pilot is going to win. Like it might be 55% favored for energy, but if it's a really good blue-black pilot against someone who's just learning energy, the blue-black pilot's going to bully them. And the other way around, if somebody's learning blue-black, that deck is so hard. So many decisions with that deck. If somebody's learning blue-black and you have a really efficient and strong energy player, they're going to get rolled over. Oh, right. Against other aggro decks, it's going to follow a really similar trend. We're generally just maxing out our removal spells. We're going to bring out Ragavan if he gets blocked, or Peddler if we don't need the hand hate. And if there's other sideboard cards that are useful in the specific matchup, we'll bring them in. So First up, in the Lurrus Mardu energy mirror match, or it doesn't necessarily have to be Mardu. It could be Boros Lurrus, it could be Jeskai Lurrus. I've seen all sorts of colors. I think you sideboard the same. You just take out your peddlers because hand hate not necessarily great in the matchup, and then you bring in your prismatic endings, your swords to plowshares. When you're up against Flage decks, Flage variants of energy, they often can go over the top of you, and you're going to want the graveyard hate to actually interact with the Flage. So you're always going to bring in the hearse, the prismatic ending, and the swords. I'm like almost even tempted to surgical flage because it's such an important card in the matchup, but I don't want to go against my own advice of don't give yourself card disadvantage with surgical. It's really critical. I wish I still had two hearses for flage energy. So these cards always come in, and then what comes out varies whether or not you're on the play or draw. You're always taking out the two peddlers, and then when you're on the play, you take out a nightmare because you're trying to go fast. When you're on the draw, you take out a Ragavan because he gets blocked. Up next, there's Burn. So against Burn, same deal, yo. Peddlers out, removal spells in. When you're up against Zoo, same deal. Peddlers out, removal spells in. When you're against any other like Lurrus aggro deck, or actually, I skipped Birthing Ritual. Birthing Ritual is the same thing. It's just removal in, Peddlers out. If you're against a Lurrus aggro deck, something like Death Shadow, you also probably want Hearse, depending on that. Like if they're playing Nethergoyf, or they're looking for Lurrus value, or they're playing their own Chthonian Nightmare. It's not a bad idea to just bring in Hearse. This is really sweet and fair matchups. And usually I'm cutting Ragavan, but again, you can use your common sense. If you think Chthonian Nightmare is going to be a little dirtly in that particular matchup, you can cut it instead of the Ragavan. If you think you want the Juggernaut Peddler, because they are playing something really funny in their deck, I couldn't imagine what, then yeah, you can go ahead and just take out Nightmares or Ragavans. You guys can feel free to play with the formula a little bit. That's why I'm making the video, to explain my thought process on why we do things. So midrange is interesting and timeless because it almost doesn't exist, just because the aggro decks are so efficient. But generally the midrange decks are the decks that abuse the free scam elementals. And in these matchups, my general advice is don't overboard. You don't want to bring in too many sideboard cards. You are the faster deck. You're trying to get under them. If you bring in too many sideboard cards, you're just going to slow yourself down and they're going to outvalue you. Because mid-range decks will always smother you in value if you don't kill them quickly. So up against Beans, what we're going to bring in is the 3 Vexing Baubles. That's why we have these instead of the Deafening Silences. And we're also going to bring in Juggernaut Peddler. Believe it or not, the Beans deck does not work when you turn their Omnath into a Juggernaut Peddler, into a Juggernaut. It doesn't work. It's the wrong 4 job for their deck. It's very funny to do it. I love doing it. I love seeing a Beans player play a Juggernaut and just attack me with it. It's my favorite thing. And then against them, we bring out the slowest part of our deck, which is Chthonian Nightmare. Like I said, we're just trying to goldfish them. And then we bring out Discharges because there's not too many small targets for removal. There's a lot of things that have 4 or more toughness, like Omnath, that we're going to want to deal with. There's things that we might want to permanent exile. Against Esper Reanimator, which I think is probably the best like Evoke Elementals build right now. That version relies on their graveyard a lot because they actually play the card Reanimate. So I do advise you bring in Surgical Extraction to counter their Reanimates. I do advise you bring in Unlicensed first to keep up continuous pressure on the graveyard. And I advise you bring in the extra removal like Swords to Plowshares and Prismatic Ending. And you play that more like you would play against Blue-Black Tempo than you would play against Beans. Against Beans, you're just getting under them. You just got to go fast. And you gotta just look at their hand to take out the thing that's going to beat you, like a Fury or an Omnath. But when you're against the Esper deck, I do think that you can just like targeted removal their frog, surgical their graveyard, and play your normal game. Rakdos Scam, joke matchup. Actually, this is like your best matchup. It's funny because like Rakdos Scam, what it does is like they put the stupid Scam Elemental into play and they put you into top deck mode. But this deck is just like nothing but like removal and cheap threats. So like you're always gonna out top deck your opponent because like every card in your deck is equivalent. So you just beat the crap out of their deck. I do like to bring in the hearses and the extractions just because they do really abuse their graveyard. The Rakdos version, they play both Reanimate and Not Dead, and with those 2 spells, for both of them, the creature does hit the graveyard and you can surgical it. Unlike the Esper version, which just use Ephemerate half the time the scam doesn't hit the graveyard. Against Rakdos Scam, every single time that Scam Elemental is hitting the graveyard. So you will get a chance to surgical it, or at the very least, your opponent just like discards the surgical and you say, yippee. At least they didn't take my creature. So you bring those guys out, and then against the deck, on the draw, we bring out Ragavan because that deck plays four Orcish Bowmasters generally. And then on the play, we bring out our Peddler and our Nightmare. I do kind of like Nightmare in the matchup because it does let you rebuild after they scam you. So that's why we keep it in while we're on the draw, and we also only take out one copy of it. All right. Almost done here. Mono black midrange. So this is like non-combo mono black decks either leaning on the One Ring or Necro. So you want to play a bit differently against the non-combo Necro deck. So actually, this sideboard is really similar now that I look at it to some of the combo Necro decks, but the thought process might be a little bit different. You're going to bring in the Juggernaut Peddlers, and not the Thoughtseizes, cool, to look at their hand. Often these decks do play Reanimate, so it's good to get the exile removal on their threats that are in their hand. We also bring in the Swords to Plowshares, because usually that deck is either going to reanimate a big stupid threat, like the Troll, or play something like a Shieldred to try and gain life off of a One Ring. You're bringing in Pithing Needle for their One Ring or Necro, whichever one they're playing, and you're going to bring in Unlicensed Hearse for pressure on their graveyard. This is kind of a broad category that includes a couple of things. There's obviously fair Necro decks, which really don't exist. There's also like the mono black One Ring deck that I played a bunch before MH3 dropped. That's kind of what I'm targeting with a lot of these things, where I say, oh, we want Swords for Shieldred. Well, that was the point of that deck. They would just draw a bunch of cards with One Ring, slam a Shieldred, and then draw more cards, and then interact with all the good black interaction spells. That deck fell off a little bit, but if you do run into it, this is how I want you to sideboard against it. And we take out Ragavan just because they are a black deck that is stacked with all the black removal in the world, as well as Bowmasters. So this little guy is never going to connect. We take out Nightmare because we want to go fast against them. And I have one Static Prison as a cut. That's a marginal cut. If you find yourself not needing to necessarily bring in all those sideboard cards, like you don't think Hearse is going to be good because the black deck you're against isn't using the graveyard, you could leave the Static Prison in. That's probably the most marginal cut. And then lastly, the only other mid-range deck that I could think of that didn't quite make the list is Sultai midrange. So in here, you're just going to bring on Licensed Hearse because they're usually Uro decks, so you just want to have a little bit of passive pressure on their graveyard. I don't think you need to overdo it, really, against this deck. I think you just gotta not overboard, keep your game plan together. I thought about bringing in more peddlers. Maybe you should bring in peddlers over Chthonian Nightmares. That would be one other thing I would consider. But realistically, I'm just going to take out a Ragavan because he's going to get blocked by Orcish Bowmasters more often than not. But no one plays like the Uro Oko Sultai midrange deck anymore because it's really not that good. It fell off a little bit. So that's the end of the list as I have it written right now. Well, 38 minutes. Wow, I know how to yap. I certainly forgot a deck. So if I did, just drop a comment saying, hey, can you update the sideboard guide for this deck? And I would say, oh shit, I forgot about that one. You got it. Or if it's more marginal, like yesterday, I remember I played twice in a row against like a mono green One Ring deck. And that would just sideboard similarly to any other One Ring deck that we would have on the sideboard. You, of course, want your Pithing Needles and your Peddlers and your Thoughtseizes for that, right? Actually, you'd sideboard the same way for like the mono black midrange. You sideboard in very similarly. Oftentimes, you can use like your common sense and you can think about what the next most similar deck is on here. Because, you know, I don't know every single random off meta brew that'll show up. I can't predict all of them. And sometimes you see a deck once or twice. I've seen that green deck a couple of times. Maybe I could have included it. So maybe I should just make this monocolor midrange because this is the same sideboarding I would use against that deck, except maybe no Hearse against them. Oh, and I would keep my Ragavans in. Keep my Ragavans, take out my Nightmares. Well, I'm teaching you guys how to do it, so hopefully you can make these sideboard decisions live. I'm going to keep this up to date with any sort of meta decks, especially as decks like come up and down in the meta. Timeless, in my opinion, is a very, very, very unsolved format. It is very possible that meta decks exist that we don't know about. For example, Jetstorm is a brand new deck. Somebody just thought about it at 2 in the morning, like a week or two ago. I'm not even joking. That's the story. Somebody pinged me at 2 a.m. on Discord saying they had a new deck. And turns out I think this is like a solid tier 2 deck. It's great. It's very hard. It's probably the hardest combo deck in the format right now. But this format's unsolved. Things will change. Things will shift around. Maybe energy decks will start playing the One Ring or something ridiculous. I've been trying that lately. Sideboard One Ring is an idea that's on my mind. Though I think that would make the deck a little bit different, and maybe I would make a separate sideboard guide for Wandering Energy if it does end up being good. I do think that this is the best build of energy without making significant changes, which is why I'm finally making this sideboard guide, by the way. If you're saying to me, should I craft this? Should I spend the wild cards? Yes. Worth it. 110%. All of these cards that are entry specific are incredibly good and they're never going to leave the shell, like the Guide to Souls Ocelot, Pride to Johnny, Ragavan. These cards are just too good. Cards like Bowmasters that are technically flex slots, or not Bowmasters. Well, Bowmasters here too, but Peddler that's technically a flex slot. Trust me, this can go into any deck in the colors. It's a really strong card in the format right now. All of these sideboard cards are really common sideboard cards in the format. And I think they're worth the real wild cards. Yes, lots of rares, lots of mythics here. Also, feel free to copy this mana base as well. 2 Surveillance, all shocks and fetches, 10 fetches, 1 of each basic. That's what I recommend. So feel free to craft these cards for the sideboard. If you build a similar deck in similar colors as well, there's no red cards in my sideboard, so any like black-white based aggro deck could use this exact same sideboard. Obviously, you want to adjust the sideboard based on your deck. So if you build like a really slow black-white mid-range deck, you don't want this exact sideboard because you're going to play the control role in aggro matchups. So you're going to want more anti-aggro sideboard cards. You're going to want like Toxic Deluge, for example. Sideboarding is very hard. It's a tough skill, so don't worry if you can't quite figure it out. I have that long-ass 2-hour, I think it is. I don't know what I was cooking there. 2-hour sideboard video. I really cooked that time. All right, I'm at the point of rambling. Energy has given me brain damage after playing it for hundreds of games. Thanks for watching, folks. I'll keep the sideboard guide on Moxfield updated. I appreciate everybody who comes and watches these videos, though. This channel didn't even exist 2 months ago. We have almost 1,000 subscribers now. You are awesome. Thanks for coming here. I love the Timeless community. See you next video.